All right. Hello. Hi. Welcome to a book party. This is officially a book party. Big one. We are here with two wonderful writers, Amanda Montell and Doree Shafrir. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
You did. You nailed it.
Okay. As someone with a tricky name, I wanted to make sure I got that right. I'm the editorial director of the Next Big Idea Club, and what we do really is wade into every amazing, great new nonfiction book, and very excited today to focus on two such books. One is called Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism by Amanda Montell, and I'll give a quick little bio of Amanda. She's a writer, language scholar, and author of two critically acclaimed books, Cultish, and the previous one called Word Slut, A Feminist Guide to Taking Back the English Language. Amanda's books have earned praise from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and others. She's currently developing Word Slut for television with FX Studios, and her writing has been featured in Marie Claire, Cosmopolitan, Refinery 29, Glamour, Who, What, Where, where she formerly served as the features and beauty editor. And you can find her on Instagram at Amanda_Montell. Amanda, welcome.
Thank you.
And partnering up here, we have Doree Shafrir, who's a writer and podcaster. Her memoir, Thanks for Waiting, The Joy and Weirdness of Being a Late Bloomer, just came out in June. It's a wonderful book, and her novel Startup was published in 2017. She currently co-hosts the podcasts Forever 35 and Matt and Doree's Excellent Adventure. She's a beauty columnist for InStyle as well. She's written about culture, women's issues, parenting, media, and celebrity for publications including The Cut, Vox, The New York Times, and Slate. And Doree was formerly an editor at BuzzFeed and Rolling Stone. She lives in Los Angeles with her family. You can learn more about her at doree-shafrir.com, or sorry, dash, it's a dash, not a hyphen, gave myself away, or at Doree on Instagram and Twitter. All right, that was a big ramp up, but thank you for being patient. You guys are both so accomplished. It takes a while to introduce you.
It's actually spooky. It's weird how many things we have in common though, like the beauty stuff and the two books and the LA. It's funny. It's no coincidence.
So I will try not to get too much in the way. I'm going to let you two just kind of have at it, but I will periodically perk up and maybe add a comment now and then. But by all means, I will now mute my microphone.
Awesome. Okay, so we're going to start out with some readings. Do you mind if I go first?
No, go first. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. So since we're both LA authors, I thought I would read a very Los Angeles excerpt from Cultish, just a few pages. It has to do with Scientology. So this is part 3 of my book. It's divided into 6 parts, and each one is dedicated to a different category of cult, from Scientology to SoulCycle. My favorite story to tell is the one about how I got kidnapped by the Scientologists. I was 19 years old, spending a lonely summer in Los Angeles with a crappy part-time job, a mild depression, and not much I could bring myself to do except pal around with the one person I knew in town, an aspiring young actress named Mani. We'd met freshman year at NYU. Mani was living in the Valley while on break from school, sharing an apartment with her mom and kid sister, auditioning for commercials and starring in USC student films. Mani was spellbinding. She had long blonde hair and cat-like Ukrainian features, wore baggy t-shirts with fishnets, and owned a pet snake. Her full name was Amanda, like mine, but free-spirited and untamable as she was, she went by the more exotic-sounding nickname, Mani. We'd carry out our days doing whatever she wanted. Mani would say the word and, mesmerized in the way insecure teenage girls always are by self-possessed ones, we'd do it. I would drive from Santa Monica to Studio City to pick her up in my Honda Civic, and we'd go thrift shopping or diner hopping or horseback riding on Tuesday afternoons in the hills, $12 for 2 hours. Or, on one day, against my better judgment, accepting an invitation to take a personality test at the colossal Church of Scientology in Hollywood. On this particular July afternoon, Mani and I were frolicking about town on our way to procure a Jamba Juice when two 20-somethings standing on Sunset Boulevard dressed for a high school orchestra performance, white button-downs, black slacks, held out a pair of pamphlets and asked, "Do you want to take a personality test?" I was a self-absorbed youth who loved nothing more than flipping to the quiz sections of 17 and Cosmopolitan to find out who my Gilmore Girls heartthrob was or what fall fashion trend I should try according to my zodiac sign. But I had also spent 2 semesters in New York City, and so had Mani. So you can imagine my surprise when, instead of bullishly power walking right past the street team as if they belonged to a species below human, Mani stopped, smiled, and said, "That sounds fun." Once we examined the literature and discovered it was branded with Scientology insignia, I thought for certain Mani would agree to steer clear of these wackadoodles, get the smoothies, drive home. But no, Mani was cool and beautiful and afraid of nothing. So the Scientology thing only intrigued her more. "We have to do it," she declared, batting her gigaparsec length eyelashes. Trying to be as down for anything as Mani was, I consented. We put our quest for frozen fructose on pause, climbed back into my Civic, drove 4 blocks, and turned down L. Ron Hubbard Way. After parking in a spacious lot, we sauntered up to the 377,000 square foot cathedral, which I'd only ever seen from afar. You might have come across photos of this place in a documentary or a Wikipedia black hole. It's that famous building with the Grecian-looking facade embossed with a story-tall Scientology cross featuring 8 points instead of 4. It's Mecca for the 25,000 Scientologists living in the US, most of whom reside, troublingly, within 12 square miles of my current home in Los Angeles. Here in LA, Scientologists hide in plain sight. They're your baristas, your yoga teachers, and your yogurt teachers, your favorite CW drama side characters, and especially all those twinkly-eyed transplants hoping to strike it big in Tinseltown. Wannabe film stars find ads in issues of Backstage magazine promising career-making crash courses in entertainment, or they attend an artist workshop secretly backed by Scientology. Others accept street team invitations to take a personality test. Some spend an afternoon touring the impressive campus, it's open to the public, or attend an intro course as a joke. Some do it with a genuinely open mind, and most get the hell out of Dodge long before they're really in. But a select few look at celebrities like Tom Cruise, John Travolta, and Elizabeth Moss, Scientology's mascots, and tell themselves, that could be me. Having big dreams makes you vulnerable. Scientologists know this, and they claim to hold the keys to help you unlock your potential. You can't clock a Scientologist in the wild by the way they dress or act, only by how they speak, and only if you know what to listen for. So I'll stop there. I realized as I was reading that there's so much that section has in common with things in your book, like the cool, mature, older girl that you're just like following off a cliff. Anyway.
I love that part of your book. So I'm so glad that you read it. I'm also going to stay on the theme and read a little bit of an LA section from my book as well. The apartment building was on a quiet street not far from the Grove, the outdoor LA shopping mall where people, maybe tourists, maybe not, like to take photos in front of its gaudy Italianate fountain, which plays music and does a show every 15 minutes or so, like a junior varsity Bellagio. It was the 5th or so apartment I'd seen in 2 days, and I was starting to get anxious about finding a place in LA since I was supposed to be moving in 3 weeks. But as soon as the landlord led me into the courtyard, I felt like I didn't even need to see the apartment itself. I knew this was the one. It was a Spanish-style building with each of the 8 apartments' windows facing the exterior or the courtyard. The courtyard itself was lush and calm, with a small fountain with a very small stream of water bubbling through it. I was enchanted. So, Elizabeth Shue and Davis Guggenheim used to live in the apartment downstairs from this one, the landlord said as he opened the door to the apartment in the back corner of the courtyard, name-dropping the actress and her director husband. And when they were rebooting Melrose Place, he wanted to shoot the pilot here, but it didn't work out. I had no particular affinity for either Davis Guggenheim or Elizabeth Shue, but he had correctly pegged me as someone who would be impressed by a tenuous connection to Hollywood fame. I was quickly learning that in LA, almost everything has a tenuous connection to Hollywood fame. We walked into the living room. The walls were painted white, but instead of feeling blank and utilitarian, the room radiated lightness. Sun dappled the hardwood floors, and archways led to the dining room and the hallway. Basement windows stretching to the ceiling overlooked the courtyard. The bedroom was enormous, light, and airy. There was a washer and dryer off the kitchen and a back door that led to a little patio and a set of stairs. Davis wanted to paint the doors to shoot the pilot, but my mom said no. And baby Neuwirth lived here for 5 years. More Hollywood. Here, I asked, opening the kitchen cabinets and drawers. They looked original. No dishwasher, I noted, but that would be fine. I'd have so much space. The apartment felt like it was double the size of my place in Brooklyn. I started picturing where I would put everything. The dining room could double as an office, and in the living room, I could get a small sleeper sofa for all of the out-of-town guests who'd probably want to come visit immediately. I'd keep the bedroom pretty spare, I thought. Probably just a bed, maybe an armoire because the closet space was tight, and get some sheer curtains to let the light in. Yep, he said, in this apartment. It seemed so LA, a romantic, beautiful apartment that had formerly been occupied by a well-known actress with another well-known actress and her director husband who used to live downstairs. Never mind that no one famous lived here now. It was the history that mattered. And so when I told people back in New York where I was living, they would be suitably impressed. I felt like I needed to fulfill their fantasy of LA as well as mine. And besides, I didn't yet know that almost every older apartment in Los Angeles has had someone at least semi-famous living in it. When I moved to LA in 2013, I was more than ready to start a new chapter. And so I decided I would say yes to everything. I'd gotten too comfortable with my insular media world in New York. It had been too easy to go to all the same parties where I saw all the same people, get into the same routines, eat at the same restaurants, and drink at the same bars. So I threw myself into my new life. I went to open gallery nights. I went to dinner parties with people I barely knew. I spent Saturday afternoons hiking. Was I losing my jaded New Yorkerness in my newfound lust for life? I wouldn't go that far, but I was actually enjoying myself. I also tried to broaden my dating horizons. I went out with a children's social worker who took me on bike trips all over LA County, but who was very cheap in a way that I had initially chalked up to environmentalism. He didn't use paper towels, but turned out to just be an allergy to spending money on anything besides weed. He was also a terrible driver. He drove his Toyota SUV leaning forward, almost hunched over the steering wheel, and way too fast with a nervous energy. One sunny weekend morning, we headed out from his apartment to go on a bike ride in the Apple Valley, about an hour and a half out of town. As he sped along the 10 freeway, cursing at drivers, switching lanes without signaling, and cutting people off, I clutched the passenger side door, praying that we'd make it back alive. I realized that you could learn a lot about guys based on what and how they drove, a piece of data, as my therapist Cynthia might say, that had not been available to me in New York. That said, I preferred accumulating that data while not being terrified I was going to die in a fiery car crash on the 10 with a guy who snored so loudly I'd once had to sneak out of his house in the middle of the night. Car culture was another new aspect of my life in LA, and I embraced it in true New York transplant fashion. I leased a convertible. I loved the idea of driving around the city, top down, sun shining. When it came time to actually get the car, my friend Michael, another BuzzFeed reporter who'd recently moved to LA, accompanied me to the Volvo dealership in Culver City. Michael was also all about his new LA life. He'd bought a shiny silver Mercedes coupe and rented an apartment in the Hollywood Hills. "You gotta get the convertible," he said. His bright blue eyes were shining. "It's perfect." The convertible was a Volvo C70, the last year they'd be making this car. We sat in the salesman office as he went over the lease terms. "Take it," Michael urged me. I took it. The car I'd selected, black on black, wasn't in stock, so the dealership gave me a loaner car that was the same model in baby blue with a white leather interior, a car that looked like I was on my way to my weekly canasta game with the gals. When I drove the car home, I immediately encountered a problem. My building had a carport in the back, and each apartment had an assigned parking space. Mine was in the middle, and there was very little space between the garage and the building. I felt my hands get clammy as I attempted to maneuver the car into the space. Then I heard a sickening crunch. While dripping with beautiful period details, vintage Los Angeles apartments were built at a time when cars were much smaller, and thus the garages and carports in these buildings were also tiny. A seemingly minor detail that I, who had never parked a car in a garage before, had overlooked. "Fucking A," I said as I got out to survey the damage. The only small consolation was that I'd scraped it along a wall of the carport and not damaged the car in the spot next to mine. I had the car for approximately 2 hours. A couple of months after I moved to LA, I turned 36. I celebrated with a housewarming / birthday party at my new apartment. My sister flew in from DC to celebrate with me. "Your apartment is gorgeous," people said, one after the other as they came in, and then I turned around and the apartment was packed. I had friends. These friends were pouring themselves drinks and admiring the art on the walls. I remembered the conversation I'd had with my former Gawker coworker, Alex, when he'd warned me about breaking up with my ex-boyfriend, John, and being at minimum 36 before I'd be having a kid. But here I was, 36 and single, and yet somehow feeling calmer about my situation than ever before. I may not have been married, but I was figuring out what a fulfilled life meant on my own terms. Maybe I needed to get out of New York in order to see that clearly. For so long, I'd been so focused on getting the approval of everyone else, men especially, and trying to make myself into someone that other people would like, that I'd completely ignored what and who I actually liked. And now I was ready for this to change. That was a little longer than I thought it was going to be. Sorry.
No, that's okay. It's always like that. And I too once crunched a brand new car on the side of a building, or on the back of a building, trying to park it in Miracle Mile.
Those garages are tiny. It's insane.
It's just doom. Also,
Yes.
I feel like the experience of searching for love and searching for spiritual fulfillment to make a connection between the material can lead you to similar toxicity in this town.
Oh, totally. I mean, as you point out in your book, like, people are especially kind of susceptible and vulnerable to the appeal of a cult when they're going through a transition. Like a
Definitely.
breakup,
Yeah.
you know?
And especially the types of people that are attracted to Southern California.
Yes.
They're dreamers, they're seekers, they're idealists. They have big ambitions. I mean, wanting to become the next Tom Cruise and wanting to become Jesus Christ himself are not that different in possibility. So
Totally.
Cool. Well, should we ask some questions?
Yeah, let's do it. I mean, I have some questions for you.
Sure.
Should I start? I can start with you.
We'll go back and forth.
One thing that I was really interested in was, you kind of posit that, like, some of the allure of cults is someone just like telling you what to do.
Right.
And I'm wondering, do you think millennials are especially kind of overtaken by decision fatigue? And, you know, is this something that feels like particularly of the moment because of like where we are in our lives?
Yes, I think it's a combination of a number of things. Cultishness tends to spike during moments of widespread cultural turbulence, like now. Pandemic, political divisiveness, social media causes extremism and radicalization in lots of ways. The 1960s and 70s, which is also a period that we think of as being quite culty, was also a time of cultural tumults. The Vietnam War, Kennedy assassination, civil rights movement. And during those times, people crave spirituality and connection and support more than ever, but they also lose trust in the mainstream institutions that are supposed to provide them with that support: government, healthcare, traditional churches, etc. So they look to alternative groups. And in the 60s and 70s, those alternative groups were like the Moonies and Jews for Jesus and the Church of Aphrodite. And some of them were destructive and some of them were relatively harmless and actually quite positive. What's different now is, well, there are a lot of things that are different now. First of all, because of the internet and globalization, increased globalization, millennials, young people have access to more opportunities, or at least the illusion of more opportunities than ever before. You know, 50 years ago, there were comparatively few directions that your career or your love life, anything could go in. And now we see, because of the internet and everything else, that there are infinite possibilities for what your hair color could be, what your job could be, what your belief system could be, what causes you could support, what brands you could patronize. It's crushing. It's like walking through the cereal aisle. You just have chooser's paradox. And we're not built for making so many well-informed decisions. We're overwhelmed by that. And so being able to defer to a very confident guru who's promising you answers and an identity provides a sort of template where it's like, if you're to invoke a beauty brand, since we're both in that world, if you've decided, oh, I'm a Glossier girl, or I'm in the cult of Glossier, then when you get up in the morning, okay, what would a Glossier girl wear? What would a Glossier girl read? How would a Glossier girl do her hair? What activities would a Glossier girl do today? Who would she follow? And that even though it's just a brand or an influencer or a celebrity that we're putting our faith into rather than a traditional church, there's a religiosity there and there's a fanaticism there. And I think, yeah, as millennials in this culture that's becoming more and more secular and more digital, our sites of community and connection become more closely tied to brands and influencers and celebrities, and the boundaries between all of those things become really blurred. So yeah, I think youth in general tend to be attracted to more alternative groups, and especially youth now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting to place that in the historical context.
Interesting is a word. Yes. I'm always just like, oh, how interesting, when I really mean like that is terrifying. But it's not actually terrifying as long as you recognize it and can place your own boundaries. Right. Okay, I have a question for you. So obviously, like, our careers and like our work have a few things in common. I think something that you and I personally have in common is that we've both been outsiders in our lives at many different points, which can obviously, be challenging. Obviously, I really relate to the parts in your book about summer camp and feeling like a dweeb amidst, the other more worldly middle schoolers. Clearly, that was illustrated in the section that I read without even me meaning to. How do you think having been an outsider at so many different points in your life has had a positive effect on who you are now and how you perceive and write about the world?
I mean, I think to some extent, most writers at least see themselves as outsiders. We are observers and analyzers. And in order to do that, we necessarily have to be at a little bit of a remove, right, from everyone else. Whether or not we thought that was kind of what we wanted. Like, if you had asked me, I would not have said, oh, as a 13-year-old girl, I want to be an outsider at summer camp. But now, in retrospect, I kind of see how that has ultimately served me, at least, professionally, right? Because I feel like it gave me a perspective on things that I might not have had if I just kind of had always been an insider. And I think it gave me the sort of like necessary pathos you need to be a writer.
What like truly cool person became a writer, or like popular person?
Right.
Right.
Yeah, like it's kind of like people who like become stand-up comedians, right?
Yeah.
Like, no well-adjusted person becomes a stand-up comedian. And so right. I feel like that is kind of, at least for me, the way I see my trajectory, I guess, evolving. And, do I still see myself as an outsider? Not exactly, but I feel like I still have a lot of the observational skills and analysis skills that I developed as someone who always felt like she was a little bit, on the outside.
A misfit. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, look at that.
Does that
Best
resonate
case
with
scenario.
you?
Yeah. No, I still feel like I'm such a skeptic.
Yeah.
And I have this sort of what feels like a really innate aversion to fully submitting to any particular group. Totally. Sometimes I really want to, though. Like the other week, I went down the kookiest rabbit hole, just watching hours upon hours of Taylor Swift super fans reacting to Taylor Swift music. And I was like, that fervor, that like truly almost like speaking in tongues, that truly like religious fervor that they have, not only for Taylor Swift, but like the community of Swifties surrounding her. I was like, that looks fun. Like that looks nice.
Yeah.
But I can't. I'm just always this voyeur, this observer, this skeptic. I've always had like one foot out the door of any group I've ever even like pseudo been a part of. And I have this habit of like leaving groups that I thought I wanted to be a part of.
Yes, exact same. I mean, my husband, like at this point, kind of makes fun of me because I will like want to be invited to everything, but like not actually go.
Yeah.
You know, it's
relatable.
like that old Groucho Marx quote. I mean, I think like then I had this feeling of like, well, does that just make me an asshole? But I think it is like it is this sort of perpetual quest to like figure out where I fit in. And ultimately not feeling like I really fit in everywhere. But that said, I feel like I've always been attracted to people, whether romantically or as friends, who do have those really strong passions.
Mhm.
Because that is so foreign to me. Like I feel like I can never fully commit to that.
Uh-huh.
And so there's something that like appeals to me about being around people who have those really
Who are
intense.
like cultier than you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah, I'll always, when I'm invited to things, and this is again just like the observational writer quality, I always want to go, but just for the story. Like if I really don't
Mm-hmm.
feel like putting on pants and going somewhere, I'm like, I have to go for the story. So okay, I'll move on to my next question for you. Or no, wait, you have what? I think it's your turn, but
Yeah.
we're not doing this formally. But go ahead.
Well, I mean, we kind of just talked about me being like attracted to people who have more of like a culty mindset, but you know, I was interested in at the end of the book, you write that you've developed more compassion for people who join cults, and I was hoping you could kind of talk about that evolution in your thinking and like where you started from, and then where you are now.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I always saw cultishness as this spectrum. So I never saw cults as like just a sort of Jonestownian, Heaven's Gate-esque remote commune full of people with shaved heads wearing robes, worshiping like a fanatical male guru. I always saw hints of cultishness everywhere, which is like why I keep leaving every group that I join. And that has a lot to do with the fact that I grew up with an ex-cult member in the house. My dad, as a teenager, was forced to join this pretty notorious cult called Synanon. He spent his teenage years there. But he knew there was something messed up as soon as he arrived, and he laid really low and didn't abide by the rules and snuck away to attend a regular school every day, even though that was not allowed. And I grew up on those stories. And also my parents are research scientists, so I grew up in a house of questioners and folks who really appreciate logic. And having grown up on those stories of Synanon, I always saw hints or really heard hints of cultish language everywhere, like in the media industry and the beauty industry and in the theater program in my high school. And so I always sort of looked down on people who submit to groups like that. I sort of got up on my high horse, like a lot of us do, maybe not even looking at a group like, a high school theater program, but certainly looking at a group like Heaven's Gate or Nexium. We as a self-protective mechanism say, oh, they were brainwashed suckers. I would never wind up in a group like that. And I did the same thing. It's just my perception of what counted as a cult was much more nebulous and hazy. And it stayed nebulous and hazy as I researched and wrote this book, because even scholars who study new religious movements don't have a hard and fast definition for the word cult. It's so subjective. So I totally was like, oh, I would never end up in a group like these, or I would never stay in one for a very long time. But I realized that this prevailing mythology that those who wind up in a group like Scientology are desperate, disturbed, intellectually deficient, it's really untrue. Like a cult wouldn't want someone who was desperate and disturbed and intellectually deficient, because they'd be liable to break down quickly. They wouldn't stick it out for years and years, even after things get really hard. They're looking for bright and service-minded people who have a lot to bring to the table. And those were the sources and survivors of various cults that I talked to for the book. They were people that I really saw myself in. They were seekers. They were just spiritual nerds, if you will. They were willing to look to sort of non-mainstream, freakier corners of culture in order to find fulfillment. And were willing to stick it out even when things got hard. And I realized that there's so much that folks who wind up spending years upon years in cults have in common with people who spend years upon years in toxic one-on-one relationships with a romantic partner or even a boss or a friend. And I've certainly been in my fair share of those one-on-one cults, if you will. So yeah, I'm always an advocate for like, instead of just making a snap judgment of someone and writing them off as some sort of idiot, to like investigate what's really going on with their psyche. And that not only makes you feel smarter, it makes you feel more compassionate because you're like, oh, you're not an alien. It's not like, oh, I've completely lost faith in humanity. It's like, I understand humanity better. And I understand that I'm not exempt from this cultish influence. And even though I might not end up in a group like QAnon or Nexium, that doesn't mean that I'm better than them. It's just humans are complex in how we make decisions.
And you know, as you were talking, I was just thinking how I have not historically had much empathy for people in MLMs. And like that's an area that I feel like I could think a little bit more deeply about why people join MLMs and like that, you know, especially for a lot of moms, it's like out of desperation.
Yeah, it's out of a very real need for, totally, it's out of a very real need for money, you know, but they're not greedy. They're looking for exactly what they were promised. And MLMs, which I talk about in the book, multi-level marketing companies, the legally loopholed close cousin of the pyramid scheme for those who aren't as familiar with this world as we are. Yeah, I mean, non-working wives and mothers have been targeted by this very predatory industry since the dawn of direct sales, and they've really mastered how to assault the like female American spirit with language and techniques of manipulation. And so, yeah, I mean, MLMers recruitment tactics are super annoying. So it's no wonder that you would immediately be like, I have no empathy for these people. But then once you learn about the history and the tactics, all of a sudden you're like, oh shit, like, ugh, that sucks.
Yeah. And, you know, I recently, during the pandemic, I had a friend whose son has had a ton of medical problems like since birth. And she messaged me and she was like, hey, I'm a new like Color Street rep, which is this nail wrap thing. And, you know, no pressure. Would you be interested in? And I was like, oh,
I know.
Like it like broke my heart, but I was like, no.
But
I
know
that was the first time where I was like, oh, like I get it. She's been like, her life has kind of sucked for 2 years, and you know, she saw this as like a bright spot. But I mean,
yeah, with MLMers, I try to remind myself to like hate the industry, not the recruit or the affiliate or whatever they call themselves. But the MLM culture is so cringy that it's hard not to kind of roast it. Okay, so speaking of language, there's so much language in our culture that's used specifically to criticize women for not meeting certain milestones or expectations for how women should live their lives, like prude, spinster, geriatric pregnancy. There's so many of these terms. How did you come around to like embracing the term late bloomer? Do you remember the first time you heard it? Like, did you always like it? What does it mean to you now? And how did it make its way into your book title?
Yeah, well, I think as like when I was growing up, I saw myself as a late bloomer, and that was a big negative for me at the time. Like, and I talk about this in my book about how I felt really behind and like really kind of like beat myself up about it, especially when it came to like sex and relationships. And I just felt so clueless and like I just missed the memo. And that was a source of like real shame for me for a long time. And then I think even in my 30s when I was single in my mid 30s, and that also became like this weird source of shame for me. Like I was, I'd had this long relationship that had just kind of fizzled out, and I was like, oh, like, why can't I just make that work? Like, what is wrong with me? And again, felt like I was kind of like behind, even though I had set these milestones for myself that were relatively arbitrary and not necessarily like true markers of adulthood, right? Like you can be a happy, fulfilled adult and not get married. Like that is a real thing. and yet in my mind, like I had just kind of created this expectation for myself. And so I think it really wasn't almost until I got pregnant, um, that I was like, hey, like I'm good about where I'm at. And like I feel good about like what it took to get here and this whole journey, and really kind of made peace with everything that I had gone through and developed a lot more empathy with my past self. Um, in a way that kind of reminds me of like what you were describing, developing kind of more empathy for people who joined cults. Like I realized I had just been so hard on myself.
That reminds me,
And
I like, just not to interrupt, I writing my book, I feel like I developed more empathy for irrational choices that I had made in my past, where it's like, what was
yeah,
like, why didn't I get out of that sooner? It's like, well, this is why.
yeah. And so I think that it actually took the writing of the book for me to feel like I could fully embrace that term. While also kind of interrogating it, because the whole idea of being a late bloomer, quote unquote, is that like, what are you late to and what
Uh-huh.
is being on time? And
And
so,
what is blooming,
and
you
what is
know?
blooming? And right. And so, I am kind of using that term to attempt to, call into question some of our assumptions around that term. And I think I talk about this in the introduction to my book, but like for men who are late bloomers, whatever that means, I mean, it's called a Peter Pan complex, and it's kind of like
Adorable.
adorable. Yeah. Oh, he's just a big kid or whatever. Like, the 50-year-old bachelor who just doesn't want to settle down, like that is kind of venerated.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, the language around women is much more negative and derogatory. And so I think I also had to kind of like wrap my head around that as well.
Yeah, I kind of when I think late bloomer, I think like puberty specifically.
Mm,
And when I read but I guess that just like speaks to my personal experience, not to overshare. um,
no.
but when I read the description for your book, I was like, oh, I love this application of late bloomer to these other milestones in life. And I think so many of us probably at some point feel like a late bloomer in some way, whether it's, a life milestone or what your body is doing or
Yeah.
anything like that.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
Yeah.
Um, can you talk a little bit about the ways in which cults like try to have a like legitimate facing um business, or
Yeah.
like a public facing I'm thinking of the yogi tea, which I did not know was part of a cult.
Yeah.
And Scientology does this, and some of the MLMs do it. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about that, and as a strategy, I guess, for, I'm assuming, recruiting people, but also like legitimizing themselves
Definitely.
to the public.
Yeah. Well, this is one of the qualities, the classic qualities of a destructive cult, is that sort of love bomb and then the bait and switch. And that can be applied not only to a group like Scientology, but to certain like Silicon Valley companies. You, of course, like want to create this impression that you're something good, and if you didn't create that impression, nobody would ever strike up with you. And in the beginning, a lot of the people who start these even really destructive groups believe that they have the answers to the world's most urgent problems. Like Scientology is presented as this humanitarian group, depending on who you're talking to though. Like they've honed their recruitment strategy pretty expertly. Like I talk about someone in the book, the story of this actress who joined Scientology in the 90s. And she was a seeker. She rejected the Catholicism she grew up with. And she was, trying on a bunch of different spiritual practices, like you try on different partners before you find your soulmate or whatever. And Scientology was originally pitched to her as like an artists group, like for aspiring artists to commune and hone their craft. And you could also learn how to communicate better and make professional connections. And this is what all of these groups do to some extent. The really powerful ones, like the Happy, Healthy, Holy organization that owns Yogi Tea, maybe will have some like entrepreneurial endeavors and will sort of like slither their tentacles throughout society in ways that are invisible to the untrained eye. But yeah, you have to create this impression that you have answers to the world's most urgent problems. You don't want to lead with the wackiest parts of the ideology because then no one would ever get involved.
Right.
And then slowly you inch people onto the freakier stuff, and you hope that confirmation bias and sunk cost fallacy and other human reasoning flaws will kick into gear. And those who really want to believe in this stuff will ultimately like brainwash themselves. But yeah, and then some of these groups, I mean, we think of cult leaders as these like evil genius masterminds, but they're really just opportunists. And so a group like Scientology and 3HO, the Happy Holy organization, what a cumbersome name, that owns Yogi Tea, they've been around a while. They've got their recruitment strategy down pat. They've got both ideologies are batshit, but they're established. But a lot of these groups they're new religions, they're brand new groups. The leader doesn't even know what they're about, like from the start. I mean, the People's Temple, aka Jonestown, started as like an anti-racist church congregation, and then evolved into this socio-political movement, and then evolved into this remote compound in South America. Like the ideology and the belief system and the name, all of it is going to change depending on the convenience of the leader. They're just going to chase power in whatever way makes sense for them at the time. But you need that positive facade. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. It just really got me thinking about, what are some other things that I had no idea were actually kind of part of,
Yeah, no, I actually considered I should do this. Before my book came out, I was keeping this like weekly column for Medium where I was like writing about things that kind of made it on the cutting room floor of Cultish. And I have another question for you that's kind of about that. And I should totally write an article that's like TK, like products and services you didn't realize were started by cults or whatever.
Yes. Yeah. Please. I would read it.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. It's a footnote within the first few pages of the book. I talk about how Yogi Tea, very popular grocery store tea brand, is owned by this pretty screwed up cult. Okay, so speaking of things that end up in the cutting room floor, with nonfiction, you want to include so much because you know so much, and invariably a lot of things don't make it in. How did you decide what details of your life to include or leave out? And were there any stories that you really wanted to include but decided for whatever reason to toss or save for later?
So because my book had a theme of being a late bloomer, I really felt like every story I told in the book had to relate back to the theme in some way. And so there were some things that I had in earlier drafts that my editor was like, this is a great anecdote, but like, kind of like, why is it here? The book originally, so right now, after the introduction, the book opens with my getting laid off in 2009 from the New York Observer. And it had originally opened with a very detailed scene of covering a party that I actually I mentioned very briefly in the book, but it's like a passing mention. But an early draft had like several pages on this party. And my editor was like, very, very diplomatically, was like, so you're not writing like a media memoir. Like this is, like this is a great story, but like it doesn't really need to be here.
Right.
But yeah, I'd love to like throw that question back at you
Oh,
because
sure.
I think you say in the acknowledgments, like there were so many interviews that you couldn't include.
Oh,
So
yeah.
what are some stories that didn't make it in?
One that comes immediately to mind because it pertains to a forthcoming episode of my podcast, shameless plug. Sounds like a cult, is a podcast. There were so many good fitness cults that I wasn't able to include. One of them is this like boot camp style workout cult called November Project. That has just some really freaky rituals and practices. I think it's an overall like very positive cult, but has some pretty ridiculous protocols and rules and whatnot that to an outsider you're like, oh my God, I like cannot believe people voluntarily participate in this. I really wanted to write about like hipster celebrity mega churches, like evangelicalism in 2021, where like people, like Hillsong and Mosaic, those mega churches that are trying to make like Jesus cool for the young people. I actually did. Oh yeah, I won't even get into it because I'll talk about it forever. But I did write a whole section about that for the last part of the book. And then I learned about QAnon and I was like, damn it, I have to scrap this and write about QAnon instead because that just seemed more urgent. But yeah, I mean, and originally when I pitched the book, there were like 12 parts of the book instead of 6. But I realized quickly that would have been really unsatisfying, like 20 pages on every category of cult. It just would have felt like an unsatisfying textbook. It would have been a mess. But yeah, with nonfiction, it's so challenging. It's like, oh, I know so much. Obviously, you're an expert in your own experience. And then there are fields of study that you can become an expert in. You're like, I want to say everything, but then you have to produce a product that feels like this is the only version of this thing that could exist, even though infinite possibilities could have existed. And I guess that's true in fiction too, but it's just like in fiction, you're making it all up. So
right. Can you talk a little bit about the process of writing this book and how you found your subjects and I'm curious about
that. So with my first book, Word Slut, that process was different because I was basically taking an existing field of study, a robust field of study with a lot of literature and research already there. And I was curating it, synthesizing it, filtering it through my voice, putting my own spin on it so that a general reader who knew nothing about linguistics could enjoy this book. But Cultish is a more like original thesis driven book. So I wasn't able to there's not like a whole field of study called cult linguistics. I wish that would have made things so easy. So I had to, basically start from scratch. And I conducted way more original interviews for the book, something like 100 original interviews for Cultish. And people sometimes ask me how I found my sources. And it's so easy to find people with cult stories who want to talk to you. I mean, in LA, especially, like you can't show up at a birthday party without running into a former cult member to really, like, that's how I found some of my sources, just like at dinner parties and birthday parties in Los Angeles. And then there are so many former cult followers who've come forward and made YouTube videos or, talked to the press about it. And so they are, very open and willing to tell their story, even folks who survived a cult as litigious as Scientology. But they were excited to talk to me, which I found very validating because they thought that this thesis that language is a cult's ultimate power tool was very interesting. So yeah, it was not that hard to find sources who wanted to talk to me, which is awesome. Yeah, so should we open it up to questions if attendees have any questions?
Yeah, let's do it.
You can feel free to put them in the chat, or there's like a Q&A. Oh, there's a question here. Will you write a Cultish part 2? I'd be interested in learning more about what, why, how of megachurches and MAGA Nation. This is kind of why I launched this podcast. I don't intend to write like a Cultish sequel or anything, but I did launch my cult podcast because it was a way to continue to talk about this material and cover all the things that didn't make it into the book in a way that felt like more fresh to me. I don't intend to write about cults again in a book format, but we do have a Mega Churches episode coming up on the podcast. So tune in there. I do have a third book idea in mind, but it's not necessarily about cults. It is about human irrationality though.
Ooh.
People, please feel free to submit questions. In the meantime, I'll just continue to ask them. Doree, do you read while you write? And if so, what books and authors helped you along your process as you were writing your memoir?
So my process of writing this memoir was, I would say I wouldn't recommend it as a method of book writing. So I sold the book when I was about 6 months pregnant. And
Whoa.
I thought, oh, this will be fine. I'll just work on this before my baby is born. And then I'll have like my maternity leave. I had this one crazy friend who is an author, and she was like, oh, I wrote my last novel like in 3 months when I had my kid. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess that's a thing that you can do. Turns out maybe it is for some people, but
No.
it was not for me. And also I sold my book as a book of essays. And about a year and a half into it, I had writer's block. I was like, I'm going to have to just rip up my contract and this book is not going to happen. And then it turned into a memoir. And so I had to basically like rip it up and start over. And so it was this like frantic few months of trying to put it together. And so I feel like oh gosh, there were a few memoirs though that I had. Oh, yes. One I did read while I was working on it that gave me some good ideas about kind of how to write about things that had happened like a long time ago was Andre Leon Talley's The Chiffon Trenches.
Oh my God, I didn't realize he had a book.
Yes, he has a
Cool.
He has a wonderful memoir where he kind of like lays it all out there and does not hesitate to talk shit about like Anna Wintour and various other people who he, worked with in the fashion industry. And it's a really great read and really compelling. And I read that and I was like, okay, this is helpful.
It's so nice to find those books that like snap you out of your writer's block. Like for me, for my books so far, one of my favorite authors of all time is Mary Roach, the like popular science writer.
Yeah.
And whenever I'm stuck on really how to start like a new section or a new chapter or something, I'll literally read like one paragraph of a Mary Roach book and be like, oh, I know. So it's so nice to have those go-to texts. We got a question in chat. What is your advice for someone who thinks they may be in a cult but isn't sure? What are the linguistic red flags to look or listen for? So Again, I think of cults along this spectrum. So there's no cult, not a cult binary. Even folks who study cults agree, like there's no real singular way to define cults or list of criteria distinguishing them from another kind of religion. But there are groups that are obviously much more destructive and exploitative than others. And yeah, it's a good idea not to be involved with those. So what are the linguistic red flags to look for? That's what the entire book is about, but I will just briefly name a few. If you find that there is an incredibly robust repertoire of emotionally charged buzzwords that are there to trigger an emotional response in you, fear, elation, anything, but also not, but you don't really know why. Like they have this strong emotional response, but they're not words that on their own like mean anything that powerful. That can be a sign that you might be under some sort of manipulative influence. If there are a lot of us, them labels, titles that are meant to lift up everyone inside of the group and imbue them with a sense of elitism and lambast everyone who's outside the group and make them feel like they're less than human, that's a red flag. I talk in the book about this concept of thought terminating cliches, which are these stock expressions that are easily memorized, easily repeated, and aimed at shutting down independent thinking or questioning. So for example, in the cult where my dad spent his teenage years, this group Synanon, a go-to thought terminating cliche was act as if. So if you wanted to express pushback or dissent, if one of the protocols or rules there didn't sit well with you and you asked why, they would hit you with the phrase act as if, which was an imperative, meaning you need to act as if you believe in the leader, Chuck Diedrich's protocols until you do. Just act as if. And that would shut that person down or silence them for a period of time. It would alleviate that cognitive dissonance. Questioning is the enemy to any cult. And so they need a bunch of thought terminating cliches, also known as semantic stop signs, as a way to quiet them down. So those are just a few, but it's all in the book. Oh, we have a question for you in the Q&A.
Oh, here we go. Okay. Doree, I loved Startup and thanks for waiting. Thank you so much. Do you have plans for a third book? Well, okay. When I was working on Thanks for Waiting, the process of the aforementioned turning it from a book of essays into a memoir was so hard. And I was like, I don't think I can do this again. Like this, it took so much out of me. But I'm now with a little bit of, hindsight, I'm now realizing that perhaps I just don't need to write another memoir that like excavates very painful periods of my life. And, have to write and rewrite them over and over again. So I'm sort of starting to noodle around for another book idea. So I think I probably will write another book. I'm not totally sure what it will be. It will probably, although I will say it will probably be fiction again, but TBD.
Hi, I was actually going to ask one more question. I know we're almost out of time, but Doree, I was wondering, was there ever a point at which you got nervous writing personal memoir and thought, maybe I'll turn this into fiction and sort of have that protection of fiction?
Well, there were some things that I wrote about in Startup that were not like, they weren't exact things that had happened to me, but things in Startup, my novel, some of them were inspired by things that I experienced. And I found that so much easier to write about for the exact reasons that you're mentioning. And when I was working on my memoir, I was like, oh, this has to all be true. This has to all be real. And like, it sounds very obvious, but as I was like, it's very, you have to be so vulnerable to write something like that. And there were times when I was like, I don't know if I'm like up to the task. Especially having written fiction and being able to have that sort of shield in front of me. Yeah.
Did you find it empowering though, in a way too? I
Yes.
wonder,
It was definitely empowering, and now that I'm on the other side of it, I'm so glad that I did it. It was frankly like very cathartic for me and helped me kind of have, like I was saying to Amanda, I think I developed more empathy for my past self in a way that I think was like really necessary for me to evolve as a person. That I don't think I would have if I hadn't written the book. So I'm really glad I wrote the book, and the response from people has been amazing. And I'm hearing from so many people who feel like, they feel really seen by the book, which is something that I wasn't sure would happen. And so that's been really gratifying. So I'm very glad that I wrote it.
I feel very seen by the book.
You feel seen. Well, I do wonder too. Sorry, my kids are making some noise in the background. Ignore them. How did you decide how much of yourself to put in? Because I know you talked about your father, of course, and his experiences in a cult. But did you feel like, were you tempted to put in more yourself, or did you feel like, there should be more academic, there should be less of me?
I loved the parts where I got to write about myself and my parents. Like, there's that scene at the beginning of the cult fitness part where I like talk about how we're all trying this really culty fitness class together. I love writing or like narrativizing my life, and I want my next book to be like more personal. But for this book, the material was just so interesting. I only felt like I was going to add something from my life if it was as interesting or entertaining as the material itself, because it's like, it would just make it boring if I talked about me. So yeah, I would mix it up. I mean, I try to strike that balance between things feeling academic and legitimate and like you're really learning something, with things also feeling like a narrative story and there's urgency and suspense. And a lot of that storytelling, sometimes it would come from my life, and then sometimes it would come from the life of one of my sources. But yeah, I only included the parts that I thought would really elevate the book or match the interest of the other people's lives. Like, my life is not as interesting as like survivors of Heaven's Gate,
I enjoyed the parts where you.
Just gonna say, me too. I was very charmed by them. So.
Thank you. Well, I want to write more. I want my next project to have more of that. So be like more heavy on the personal, still with academia and research in it, but the balance will be sort of like inverted in the next project.
Ooh.
Well, I'm looking forward to when Cultish comes out as a paperback and you get to write like the cult hit.
Yes, the cult followed book. Actually, it's been really fun writing like spooky culty things in like the signed copies of Cultish, and like writing just mysterious drawings and doodles to like fuck with people. Am I allowed to curse? Yeah, it's been fun.
You just did. It's totally fine. All right, well, let's wrap it up with an F-bomb. I like it. Thank you, Amanda and Doree, for joining us. This was really a fascinating conversation. Thank you everyone for listening. Next Big Idea Club. Check us out. We have an app. We have a website. We're all over the place, many platforms. And by all means, get your copy of Startup. Not Startup. Excuse me.
We'll get that one too.
You can start.
Get Startup too.